Thank you all so very much for being here this evening. I am very pleased that we have artist Stephen Young Lee with us for the BMA's Bunting Biennial Ceramics Lecture. The late Dr. Peter Bunting and Mrs. Derry Bunting established this program more than 10 years ago, and the idea was to provide an opportunity for the museum to bring ceramic artists and scholars in the field to Birmingham to share their work and other news from the field of ceramics. And with our great strength in ceramics, of course, that made perfect sense. To date, we have hosted Magdalena Dundo, Susan Falwell, Larry Allen, who I think is maybe here with us as well, Kathy Butterly, Garth Clark, Dr. Glenn Brown, and tonight, Stephen Young Lee. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Derry Bunting and her family, who are with us as well this evening, for their continued generosity and support. We are honored to work with you on this program and are grateful to share the opportunity to share the work of illustrious ceramic artists with our community. Now to Stephen Young Lee, who's an acclaimed artist based in Helena, Montana. He's a graduate of Alfred University in New York, and he served as director of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts for 16 years, a position that he held alongside his own studio practice. As the son of Korean immigrant parents, Steve draws inspiration in the beautiful work he creates from identity, assimilation, and place. He's lectured extensively, and in 2016 was one of 4 artists featured as part of, sorry about that, Steve, I think I changed your slide. He was one of 4 artists featured as part of the Renwick Invitational at the Smithsonian Museum in Washington. His work has been shown in numerous exhibitions, including at Crystal Bridges, the Portland Art Museum, and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And his work has also been collected by the Smithsonian, LACMA, Crystal Bridges, the Newark Art Museum, the Everson Museum of Art, among others. So suffice it to say, Steve is a big deal, and we are lucky to have him with us tonight. So please welcome Stephen Young Lee.
Okay. Well, this is my first time in Alabama, so thank you. Everyone I've met has been so friendly and welcoming and just lovely, and the museum has been such an impressive institution to see kind of the scale and the sort of quality, I think, that everything's been operating at. So it's just been a great start to my visit here, so I appreciate having a chance to spend with all of you. But I wanted to thank Anne, Rachel White, who gave me an awesome tour this morning of the collection, Katie, Rachel's been like kind of organizing, keeping me on track. Katie gave me a great tour of the collection, and Angela, Jade, all the staff have just been really, lovely to kind of work with. And also to the Bunting family for sponsoring this. I think it's an amazing thing that you're really trying to raise the awareness and appreciation of ceramics for Birmingham. And I want to thank our friend Leslie Farron, who introduced me to Anne, has always been a connector of sorts for a lot of different people. So I wanted to start my lecture. This is a Korean porcelain pekja, or the porcelain jar, from the Joseon Dynasty. And the reason I show this is because when I was in high school, one of our assignments was to choose an object and then try to recreate it in ceramics. It's a very kind of typical assignment. And for some reason, I just found this image in like a Korean art book. I didn't study it, I didn't know anything about it, I just thought it was very beautiful. But I only had this like one photograph. So I used this photograph as like a map, or a guide to try to recreate it. So I was like just learning how to throw, and then I'd use underglazes and I'd draw these grapevine patterns. But the problem is like, I got to the edge of the pot and I didn't know what was on the other side because it was only like one image of this thing. So it was this like very clear moment for me that like I had to kind of use the information that was available and try to understand like how I would then create the remainder of that decorative motif on the other side of the pot. And I'd like to just share that because like there is something for me that I think is pretty consistent in my practice where I just really love these objects. I love seeing them. I think they're so beautiful. And the act of like trying to recreate something and see it three-dimensionally in front of you it provides a lot of information about like what some of the concerns, questions that a maker, 1,000 years ago was having, that I'm sharing that, in some ways. So it kind of creates a connection through history. So for me, my practice involves like reproduction of historical elements in an effort to understand and reinterpret aesthetics and context. I use ceramics specifically to explore identity for myself, cultural influence through material and craft. This is a piece called Birds of North America from 2007. Now for today, I'm going to share a little bit of some of my earlier work, but then mostly I'll focus on kind of later projects. This is like how I started. So when I went out of high school, I eventually went to undergrad, studied business for 2 years, which is a mistake. And then I kind of found myself at the ceramic studio most of the time. So I decided to kind of pursue this path in functional pottery, which was something I was very drawn to because of there was a certain structure to it, there was a rhythm to it, and I just loved making these objects that were useful, that were handled by people, that were shared, sharing meals, sharing drinks with others. And in terms of my aesthetics, I found that I kept kind of coming back to this, Korean, I was looking at a lot of Korean pots, Chinese Sung Dynasty, things that didn't have a lot of decoration, but were very sort of austere in their form and deep volumes. And, again, I was drawn to this, the accessibility of the pots, the intimacy that you have with these objects, and it's this pursuit of, for me, it was always this pursuit of perfection. Like, you're trying to take this object through this whole process into the fire, out of the kiln, without any flaws whatsoever. So it's almost impossible, but, you just get sort of obsessed with it. You just kind of can't stop trying to, achieve that in some way. And, I was selling a lot of this work through craft fairs, and I was, selling through galleries. And craft fairs for me were very interesting because I'd have this very direct engagement with the audience, And sometimes it was dumb questions, even though there are no dumb questions. Sometimes they were not the greatest questions, why is this purple or whatever it might be. But a lot of times people would just say things very bluntly, oh, it looks very Asian. It's a very Asian aesthetic to it. And I remember always thinking about that, what does that mean exactly? Because it kind of does. It has similar glazes, similar forms, similar proportions. And it had a lot to do with what I was looking at, where the source material was coming from. But it also made me question as to why I'm drawn to that. Is it because I'm an Asian American? I was born in the US. My parents immigrated here from Korea. So for me, I was constantly searching and trying to understand, what my place was in society and in this culture, through the work and through making things. And sometimes it's very elementary, but I think that's been a consistent thread through a lot of what I've done. And I moved into these different areas. When I was in Chicago, I was one of many Korean Americans. And then I went to school in Alfred, where there weren't a lot of Asians. And now I live in Montana, and I'm 0.7%, but 0.5 now that I'm here in Birmingham. So it's constantly shifting, how you sort of fit into these understandings of who you are. So fast forward, after making work as a potter, I went to graduate school. That was a whole kind of scrambling of your brain in a way, in a great way. And I was questioning a lot about this identity as a potter, which is another thing that you can feel very committed to, very regimented about. And it has certain principles, certain ideals, certain work ethic. But grad school kind of let me step back from that a little bit and experiment with different things. And after I had my thesis show, I had this opportunity to go live and work in China for a year. So Wayne Higby, who was my instructor, had helped me get this fellowship that enabled me to just move from the US and live in Jingdezhen, China. So that was I didn't really think that much about it. If I had, I probably maybe wouldn't have gone, but it's just when you're young, you're just sort of following whatever the next thing is. So this is an example. This is the large pot factory. My friend Lee Summers is here. He spent a lot of time in China and speaks amazing, fluent Mandarin. But I went from having a graduate degree, a master's degree in ceramics, moving to this town that had 1,000 years worth of experience working in a very specific material. And they were doing things that I just never even thought was possible. And I had an advanced degree in ceramics, so like I never would have thought you could make these kinds of pots. So the large pot factory, they're throwing all these sections out of porcelain and then stacking them and making these large vases. So for scale, if you look to the bottom left of that photo, there's a motorcycle. So they're 15, 20, 25 feet tall, right? The kilns that they build specifically for that. So it's just my brain was expanding at a rate that I couldn't even keep up with. This is photos I just took while walking down the street. It was also a place where this one material and these objects that were being produced there kind of defined life and culture in that city. So, people were very comfortable with it. They understood it at a level that you couldn't even imagine. And then there's also this access to the history. So these are the antique blanket markets. You'd walk down the street and then they'd have these shards that were genuinely from the Ming Qing dynasty. And they would excavate these as they were constructing new roads. There would be cuts out of the hillside and people would just be climbing and scrambling through and grabbing these shards out of the ground. So that was really amazing to me to just feel that connection to something that was so far away in time, but here they were, these remnants that sort of showed us what was happening in that civilization at a different period. This is a photo I took when I was walking down the street in Shanghai, and it just kind of summed up my whole experience of how I felt. At first it seems this doesn't seem right, something seems there's some dissonance here. But then, and that's kind of how I was feeling. I was a Korean American living in China. I didn't speak Chinese. I don't really speak Korean very well, and I had to learn how to speak Chinese to get around. And I just always felt like this other thing, I could just not say anything and people had no idea where I came from. And the second I opened my mouth, it was oh, who's this guy? So that constant kind of awareness, of where I sort of fit in was something that was very present in my experience there. One example of that is what question I was asked very frequently is what's your sign, right? Which is something we hear here all the time, except they were asking for a very different zodiac system, right? So I grew up, in Chicago. We'd always go to eat in Chinese restaurants, and my sisters and I would sort of look at the placemats, find who you are. And then I was a rabbit, right? So luckiest of all signs, you are also talented yet articulate, affectionate yet shy, you seek peace throughout your life, marry a sheep or boar, your opposite is the cock. Okay, so I lived my whole life looking at these placemats, thinking, using this as a definition for our personalities. My sister was this, my mom was that, etc. So I found out, however, because my birthday sort of falls very close to the Lunar New Year, and that changes every year, right, based on the season, position of the moon, etc. So I found out for the particular year I was born, my birthday fell on the other side of the new year. So instead of a rabbit, I found out it was a tiger. And I was 30. And I just discovered this moment oh my God, I spent my whole life thinking I was this one thing. And then I was telling everybody that. And all the Chinese people who were asking me, I'm I'm a rabbit. They're oh, that must mean you're this, this, and this, right? So they were using that as a basis to understand who I was and my personality. And that would switch halfway through my year. So tiger, aggressive, religious, candid and sensitive, look to the horse and dog for happiness, beware of the monkey, right? And not looking out for the monkey. And for me, this was such a simple, kind of dumb thing, right? But it really just rocked my understanding of myself, and how I sort of fit in and how other people fit in, and are there other people who are going to find out similar things? But it made me really just kind of look at these systems that we use to kind of define and place ourselves within society, like sometimes that's religion, sometimes it's politics, sometimes it's, skin color, whatever it might be, that sort of figures out who's like us and who's them, right? So to me, that was it was very freeing, to just feel, like luckily I was in China, I was in a place that I just felt like, okay, I can just kind of start to figure out my identity, like it doesn't have to be against anything, it's something that's sort of being created every day for each individual. I also became very enamored, this sort of started in grad school, but I started looking a lot more intently at blue and white ceramics, which, these objects were very present in my childhood. I'd see them around the house, or you'd see them at restaurants, that kind of thing. But then, really kind of looking at like the history of it, how it shifted the economies of countries, or, how they also became these objects that started carrying information from one culture to another. And, back when you couldn't travel very freely, but like if you wanted to know, like, what is it like in China? It's like, well, here are these objects that are sort of showing you a little bit about what they believe, what they might be doing, sitting under a tree, meditating, whatever it might be. And then you have these examples of objects that were like, okay, so those objects travel to Europe, and then now the Europeans are kind of looking at it and going, oh, well, we want to make some objects too, but they're looking at it through the lens of their own experiences, right? So you have these examples of chinoiserie, which is like, they're trying to recreate something, but then their own background kind of has to get imprinted on it. So you have like the English bow factory plate on the left, and then on the right, what I dub Salvador Dali Buddha from Meissen. It's like, what a bizarre thing, right? But that's just what kind of came out of that. And I think it's such an amazing thing, like how these things can kind of come together and then be expressed in a very different, unique way. I also spent a couple months in Korea with no real purpose other than to just try to like immerse into the culture. I visited a lot of museums. I took language classes. I studied and read a lot of books. But what I found about the Korean ceramics too was that, here's a country that had gone through so many different periods of oppression, or war, or, whatever, like a lot of different kind of major life-shifting events. And then the work to me was also expressing, like, in a very different way, maybe how Chinese artists would make it, or Japanese, or, and I love the kind of freedom and the expressiveness, in the painting, which is very different from like Ming Dynasty wear, or, even a lot of the European work. So like, you had this like, we don't even know what's gonna happen tomorrow, so we're just gonna draw a dragon, and it might look like a hand puppet, but it's like, that's just kind of the mentality. So I became very like attached to these pieces specifically from the Joseon Dynasty. And then also Korean Goryeo Dynasty wear is like the introduction of inlay into ceramics, which is a very specific Korean contribution to ceramic production worldwide. And in Korean it's called sangam, although people say mishima, which is kind of incorrect, but I won't get into that. So anyway, that's another thing. So I was taking all this information, I came back to the US, I was teaching, and then I was trying to figure out how to sort of pull together all these experiences and then make it make sense in terms of like who I am, as a person navigating the world. And I started making these jars, and this is a bit of a continuation of some of the work I was doing in graduate school, but in a very different format. So this was a piece I made called Granary Jar, which had these characters from like cereal that I used to eat when I was, a kid. That like my kids don't even know what they are. My kids they don't even get close to these kinds of cereals anymore. But I was reading these boxes, sitting there, eating Frosted Flakes, eating, Trix, or whatever, like Honey Nut Cheerios. And then it was interesting because I sort of I did this deep dive into like cereal mascots, and there's so many of them, but like only certain ones of them endured like throughout history, For whatever reason, Tony the Tiger, Trix Rabbit, certain things just kind of like stayed in our psyche. This is a piece called Jar with Clouds and Bald Eagles. So I was looking for these sort of discordant relationships, things that also, if you look at the jars from China, it's like you have these mythical figures kind of flying through the clouds. And I think there's a certain American mythology too that comes along with the symbolism of certain animals. This is a piece called Prehistoric Jar. And I just remember thinking, I know dinosaurs were going through those landscapes at some point that you see in museums. So that's kind of what inspired that piece. And then I came across this jar. This is in the BMA Museum in Seoul, which is an incredible museum of both historical and contemporary work. And this jar in particular has just really captivated me because the way that it's made, if you look at it, it's sort of made in two parts. So the potter is throwing the bottom section like an inverted cone, and the top section is they throw as a bowl, and then they stack on the top of the bottom section. But here you can see the weight of the top section sort of buckled at that seam, and it created this imbalance in its symmetry. But they left it, because as a jar, in terms of its identity as a thing, it's still performing what it needs to perform. It has a volume, it doesn't leak, But then the potter was able to just say, I'm just gonna leave it this way, and then create something that's completely unique, right? So he can make 10 jars, they're all gonna be totally different from each other, but they're still jars, they're still serving their purpose. And I just thought that was such a powerful metaphor for myself, to think about well, what are the things that are important, And there's a Joseph Campbell quote that I like to share. So it says, "Perfection is inhuman. Human beings are not perfect, but what evokes our love is the imperfection of a human being." And he speaks about the perfect human or the perfect God as being kind of uninteresting, a little boring, It's how do you match up to that? And I think about this with my kids a lot, It's I never think about the times where my kids were good, I think about the times where things went wrong, terribly wrong, right? When my son was on the plane and he pooped in his diaper and it shot out his arm, arm sleeve, I remember that. I'm gonna remember that till the day I die, right? But you don't remember he ate all his carrots today. That's okay. So for me, that kind of led to allowing myself to make this series of work that was really trying to embrace the perception of failure in ceramics in these vessels, because you look at a vessel that has a crack in it or it has an explosion, it's oh, what happened? Or that's terrible, But if you eliminate that kind of judgment from it and just allow it to sort of exist, then certain things can be revealed that you would never anticipate, but could also be very beautiful or very impactful. So this was one of the first pieces that I made. It's called Landscaped Jar in 2009. And, again, I was just trying to kind of let myself free of expectation in these pieces. And I found that beauty can really be found in the unexpected and being open to new possibilities. And it gets for my process, what replaces this ideal image is improvisation and reaction. So I'm opening the kiln and I'm trying to see well, what happened this time, and then is there more life to this? Is there more activity? Do I stop here? So it's a really interesting dance for me, and it's something that keeps me kind of captivated in the studio, just taking away. When you try to strive for something, usually you're disappointed, especially with ceramics, it will always disappoint you in some way. But if you allow it to kind of show you things, then it's a very different dynamic. So sometimes with these pieces, I am thinking a bit more about how they're formatted. So here you have the dragon kind of moving in and out of the crack in the work. This is a piece where I was utilizing underglazed red, which is a certain genre of ceramics in multiple cultures, but very volatile, very unpredictable. So I was thinking about what if you just let it run, let the glaze run and do its thing? Because glaze, when it runs, is so beautiful, but we're always trying to keep it from running. We're trying to like control it, but it naturally wants to do that. This is a piece that was inspired by a Minoan octopus motif. So here you have the tentacles kind of like grasping at the opening. So sometimes I'm using the decoration as a way to like orient what's happening in the piece. Here you have the cranes are kind of escaping out and like flying around the vessel. A little bit about my process. So here, I love visiting museums. Like this has been such a great trip because I get to like see all these cool pieces, and I often like go to museums and I just sit there and draw and collect these motifs. Many of which show up in different like country areas of the world, but they're being translated based on like who the local artisans are. So some of them, you see them come up again, in different fashions. So I usually take those images and then I still make pottery. I love making functional pottery, so I'll kind of apply those to pots that are meant to be used. But then for the larger sculptural pieces, I tend to make these pieces in series. So these are all thrown in sections, and then I'll assemble them. And I do try to have a certain amount of integrity in terms of the form and the proportion. Because to me, I feel like that tension exists because I am really trying to make these as beautiful or symmetrical as I can, but then you allow the other things to kind of affect that later. But I think that the imprint of the original form is still there. This is 2 halves of a moon jar, and then that jar assembled, and the release of tension in the form. So that people ask that sometimes, like, when do you do the cracking thing? Okay, this is when it happens. And then typically before I crack the piece, I do all the inlay. So here I'm using a knife, I'm doing all the drawing and carving a little channel in the surface of the pots, and then filling that in with a cobalt slip or a copper slip or something else. And I like this kind of hybrid sangam inlay thing that I worked with because for me, I don't want the work to be about like the painterly expression. I don't want it to be about my ability as a maker to have this kind of like skill that's beyond someone else. It's really like, I want it to be almost graphic. It's an image that's being overlaid on a crafted piece, right? So that there's something that, because in China, for example, like blue and white painters, like they have they're like ranked, like, oh, this person's really good, this person's not so good, So I just want there to be like no question about that kind of heroism in the imagery or the making of the imagery. This is a piece that has more of like a sgraffito, so it's a white slip on top of the porcelain and I'm carving through that. Here's an example of that. This is a piece I had first show at Duane Reed Gallery. And then they go into the kiln and kind of can be a surprise. Like sometimes things happen in a way that I had not expected whatsoever, and sometimes it does less, so it's always a little bit of a question mark as far as what's going to happen out of the kiln. And, I could never plan that, like that's something that just like came to be, right? Like this beautiful fold, and just seeing the way that the decoration is stretching and moving, to me, that's so exciting when I see examples of that. Obviously I can orchestrate it to some level. So this is a basin that I fired on its side, and like it just basically closed on itself, right? And then here's a piece that I showed earlier. So these 2 pieces are glazed together. And, this came from a conversation with a curator about how these Korean forms were it's often meant to like be married to one another. So it's like you're playing with positive and negative space. This is a vase that's at the Crystal Bridges Museum. This is a piece called Moon Jar with Spaceships. You can kind of see there's like little rocket ships flying across the surface. Jar with Tiger and Clouds. This is a piece at LACMA. And I started looking at so another aspect of my work is like, I think a lot about like, there weren't many images growing up as a Korean American that you actually felt some sort of pride in, so like in terms of mainstream culture. And Godzilla was one. Godzilla was like, everybody knew who Godzilla was. It was coming out of Japan, these giant monsters that were sort of protecting the world, and like that was an example of something that universally everyone could kind of understand. So like, I was thinking about that, you have like Mothra, like these really kind of insane premises, but they became part of the mainstream culture. This is Mazinger Z and Aphrodite A, which were like giant robots that sort of protected the Earth. And then I also done some pieces where I was kind of thinking about color as a way, or color as a meaning for symbolism. So this piece, Blood Moon Jar, was made actually during a blood moon in 2021, I think it was. And also thinking a bit about like how blood type is a personality indicator in Asia in a way that it's not here so much, like depending on your blood type and how you fit with other people. This is called Asian yellow baluster vases. So, yellow having very different meaning. Like in China, for example, it's an imperial color, and then in North America, it can have very like derogatory sort of implications to it. This jar is a moon jar brown, which, during the period of like social unrest in this country, like brown suddenly became this very specific category that I don't think Asians were really included in, but then sometimes they were, and like, to me, like, I just thought like that was interesting how like, we were creating certain words or like certain places where, like, I just didn't know where I fit into that. And then this was another series of pieces that I made after certain elections, and just thinking about like similar kind of questions, and also like how certain combinations of color and motif can create a specific sort of reaction, or you have something that is as like sacred as the American flag, but then it's on like swimsuits like printed on hats, and it's just so like present, right? But then it really is something that's supposed to hold this very like deep meaning. Here are a few kind of larger projects that I've worked on since then. This was one of the first that I did. It was for a show in New York at the Jane Hartsook Gallery. And sometimes like the space makes an impact or inspires certain ideas. So at the gallery, they had a really long flat wall that I wanted to try to figure out a way to make work for. So I conceived of this color panel, these color panels utilizing a series of decorated cups that was titled Red, Blue, and White. So I made, each panel had 100 cups, and I think I had to make like 400 to get 300. And then I started working with assistants for the first time, in the studio. So like we were trying to kind of zone in on this thing and like really orchestrate this end result of this piece. And I did want this piece to look like it would be like you're standing in front of like a Rothko painting. So it's not about the information so much, but it's just like the effect of that color and the significance of that color kind of absorbing your body presence. So it's not imagery in terms of like any sort of narrative or, kitschy kind of thing. It's just really like using decoration or decorative motifs that were a little bit more benign, but then also like very present in many cultures around the world. This piece is currently in the collection of the Dong Museum in Sedalia, Missouri. And then in 2019, I had an opportunity to have an exhibition at the Portland Art Museum. And again, they had a huge, big wall in the gallery space that I thought would be an amazing thing to try to create something specifically for it. And they gave me the opportunity to look at some pieces in their collection, one of which is like one of my favorite kind of genres of folk art is Minhwa paintings from Joseon Dynasty in Korea. And these are paintings that were painted typically, from what I researched at least, by itinerant painters to kind of bring luck to families in the new year. And they were all very different. You know, they had very different styles and very different interpretations, but like the characters, so like for this one, for example, there's a tiger and then there's a magpie, and like what I've read is that like sometimes the tiger represents like the ruling class and the magpies the people. So they became these kind of like social commentaries about like what was happening in Korea in these moments, right? So like the tigers kind of look dumb, you know, they look goofy, and the magpie's like a source of reason, sort of speaking into the ear. So they had this beautiful example of this this painting, and then I was thinking about like how could I maybe recreate that using, you know, imagery that is more relatable to myself and my upbringing. So I started finding these images, and you know, the tiger for me, like Tony the Tiger, is just so personal, right? Like that was my go-to when I was growing up. And then I used to watch these like Heckle and Jekyll cartoons all the time when I was a kid from Terry Tunes. And also magpies are very present in Montana. And to me, they're like the most beautiful birds with that iridescent blue and the white. But then people in Montana like hate these things because they're loud and they like, you know, they wake you up in the morning. So I thought that was interesting that they had such different perceptions of that. So again, I was working with other people to kind of figure out how to like format this, and then, you know, I like the idea of like transposing it on something where it's a little pixelated and there's like some loss of information on the surface. And then I decided to transpose the imagery onto a series of plates that would be hung on the wall. And then I had to learn how to do this whole jigger jolly process to like make consistent plates. And then make the plates and then transfer the image over to it. And it was a big space, so I only had like so much table space, so I had to work it in sections, and I never really got to like see the whole thing at once. So I had to be pretty specific about the planning with it. And then with inlay, unfortunately, there aren't many ways to like build value. So to get black, I had to like stipple like endlessly for hours. That's the only reason I'm including this video, is I want you to know how hard this was, how long it took me. And then this was the video of us installing the piece at the museum. And it was interesting, like to be as the maker, like I could actually design the plates so that they had a way to hang them more effectively. So I carve out a little part in the foot ring that would just hang on a nail. So having that knowledge around like the whole aspect of making it was helpful in this instance. And this is an image of the final piece. I also made a piece, this was a different kind of piece, but like, so for me as like a young Asian American, like Bruce Lee was the mainstream example. Like he was like the only thing we had to like have that real sense of pride. And I think it wasn't just Asians, it was like a lot of people, right? But I think that oftentimes like his legacy is defined as like this kind of corny like martial arts films, but his impact is actually much deeper than I think most people realize in terms of the impact on like martial arts education in the United States, in terms of philosophy, in terms of like his kind of representation as a strong Asian presence, you know, in culture. So I wanted to create a piece that was a tribute to him that wasn't about like the films and the like, you know, industry of entertainment. So I found this image of him that I thought was just a really beautiful portrait of him as like an intense and incredibly driven person who was sort of like unafraid, you know, but dealt with many setbacks in his career. So for this, I also had to use like custom decals that were then put onto the surface. So these were sort of split up and then transposed onto the plate. So this piece was called Icon, and it's in the collection at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And then a more recent piece that I created in 2023, which was the 2-year anniversary of the Atlanta spa shootings. So March 16th, 2021, 8 people were killed, 6 of them were women of Asian descent. The shooter targeted massage parlors because there's this perception of sex work, and the shooter had a sexual addiction. So there's like very simplistic kind of association with what was happening there. And also the way that it was handled in the media by the law enforcement. The sheriff who was in charge of the investigation said, well, I guess it was a really bad day for him, and this is what he did. Like that was actual quote that kind of came out of it. So it was this sort of like othering, or like a reduction of who they were because they were sort of grouped into a category of people. So, I just was trying to like find a way personally. It's like, is there a way we can sort of memorialize or like commemorate, who they were as individuals, so that they weren't just this like group of people in another event, and another shooting, and another, moving on to the next thing. So working on these series of plates that would also contain a portrait for these 6 women. And then as kind of natural to my process, like these plates started to crack, and then I started to break them apart, and then I'd repair them using the kintsugi, like gold repair, which seemed a very sort of appropriate metaphor for like, the struggles that they went through, to immigrate into this country, to work these kind of awful jobs for the sake of their families, for the sake of their, people that they were trying to bring over, but then hopefully rebuild that into something new, but still broken. So this piece was called Shattered Dreams and Movements of Change. Because one of the only positive things that came out of this experience was that it kind of galvanized the Stop Asian Hate movement, which for many years had just been, oh, here's another person that got beat up in a subway, here's another person that got attacked randomly, And I think that it finally kind of was like, okay, like, can we organize and try to figure out a way to like really address this issue, and be a bit more intentional about the way that like all the information is coming out, etc. So, that's why there's kind of like this moment of tragedy, but then from it is born like these women have sacrificed to create something new, and that will hopefully enact some change in these circumstances. So again, like kind of representing like their dreams of being immigrants. It's like you have the red, white, and blue sequence, and then the individual portraits. So this is Dao Yo Feng, Hyun Jung Kim Grant, Sun Cha Kim, Soon Chung Park, Xiao Jie Emily Tan, and Yong A Yu. So along with the plates, there were also biographies that were created by the Stanford Library. So those placards were kind of included, so you could read a bit about like their journey, their life and struggles in the United States. I've been fortunate enough to have this travel and be seen, in different public settings. So it was on display first at Duane Reade Gallery, then it went to the Korea Society in New York City, and then it traveled to Icheon, South Korea in 2024, and then this spring it'll be at the NCCA conference in Salt Lake City at the Salt Lake City Museum. So that's the intent, is just to hopefully keep it kind of traveling and hope be seen, and help to educate around like that particular event. I'm going to end with just like a couple of recent experiences that I had that I feel so grateful for. But in spring of 2024, I was invited to do a residency and have an exhibition in Gwangju, South Korea, at the Asia Cultural Center, or the ACC as we were calling it. And Gwangju it's south of Seoul, and it's kind of known as the site of the 1980 Gwangju Democratic Uprising, which was a series of protests mostly by students against oppressive, militaristic president of Korea. And it really kind of had an effect where they were able to win some of their freedoms back and change, the structure and the policies that were in government. So it was, unfortunately, a lot of people were killed, were tortured, and arrested, but they were fighting for like the good of the country into the future. So like the city of Gwangju has a lot of pride in that like moment, and they're very much respectful of like trying to honor that into the future. So the ACC is an organization that's funded by the government, but they are really trying to provide education on a bunch of different fronts. So part of the experience was that I was going to be there for 3 weeks, and I sent some work that I made, and then I'd also make work while I was there using Korean clays and glazes. So I worked at Chosun University. This is the studio, and then it was also during like the plum blossom season, which was like really beautiful. And this was a studio, so I was working there. In the end, I only had like 2.5 weeks to like finish a body of work that would be included in the exhibition. So we were working like full days, and that was kind of the sole purpose of being there. But one idea for me was I wanted to make this series of moon jars. Again, that was like thinking about like color association. So here, this is like day 4 or something like that. And then part of the arrangement was that we'd be working with students and members of the community who were kind of observing the activity. And there were 3 artists that were in residence also in the exhibition, but only 2 of us overlapped at a time. So one of those artists is shown here, Seoul, and then we were all kind of like firing together and talking and trying to figure out like how to navigate like the language and the culture and all this stuff. It was a really kind of wonderful experience. With a lot of highs, here we were loading one of our last kilns. And then also just trying to understand like how the materials worked, how the equipment functioned. And it was right up until the end. So this was the last piece that I was delivering to the exhibition like by taxi and then carrying down the escalator. But they were very, they had a lot of resources available for the show. So they designed every aspect of this show, including the display. So they were building all of this while we were there for the residency. And then this was the exhibition. So the 4 artists were Linda Lopez, Seo, who is an adopted Korean, that his first experience being in Korea was this residency. So he's like in his 30s. And then Amy Lee Sanford, who's Cambodian, and then myself. So this is Linda Lopez's work. This is Seo's work. And then these are some of the pieces. So this red, white, and blue set of jars is the piece that I made when I was there. And the title of this is called Imperfect Pride. Blurry. The piece on the left is the one I was carrying down the escalator. That's called Last Night in Gwangju. And then the one on the right is a Maybyung vase with eagles and clouds. And then the opening was like Gwangju had never had a major ceramic exhibition like this in the ACC or the ACC. So this was like their first kind of major exhibition of ceramics, and they had press come in from Seoul. They had people from all over the country. College students came because there was so much curiosity about like why ACC, which was a very respected organization, was putting themselves behind something like this. So I think similar to this weekend where you have the Bunting family that's kind of like providing resources to present something. It's like there's a curiosity with that. So, well, what is it about ceramics? What's so interesting about this? Why is this important? And then a similar thing was happening there that piqued a lot of people's curiosity, and I know it has had an impact, in terms of the arts and culture scene there. Lin Young Jo was seen here with the microphone. She was the main curator, and she's the one who invited and worked with all of us. And it was a big opening. I mean, there was a lot of there were a lot of like dignified people there, not us, just entertainment. But these 2 were kind of my main folks. So Harim Kim was the interpreter, and then Lin Young was the curator. And they made like a sticker set. This woman, she like she made stickers out of my work that would be sold in the gift shop, which had never happened to me before. And then from that exhibition, I was invited to be part of the Gyeonggi International Ceramics Biennale, which was in Icheon. So they took a bunch of the work that was in that show and then moved it up to Icheon. And this is every 2 years there's a big international ceramics competition, but then as part of it there's a curated exhibition, and this year it was by curator Lee-sun Rim. So, was able to go back again in the fall and then be part of this really amazing experience there. And here there were maybe 100 artists that were represented, including Tip Toland, which is a large figure, Roberto Lugo, Kim Simonson from Finland, Jeremy Brooks, Wook Jae-meng. So here is similar work, and then I sent that piece over from the US, but in a different kind of display. And this is my Korean crew. These are very amazing artists and educators from Korea, or also some of them are teaching in the United States. So Sungguya and Mitsuya are in Athens, Georgia at UGA. Jaewon Lee was at Michigan State for many years and recently retired. In-jin Lee is maybe one of the most influential teachers at Hongik University. And then Sung Jae Choi also teaches in Uyo. So to end, what's next, right? So for me, as Anne mentioned, I was the director of the Archie Bray Foundation for a little over 16 years, and a place that has a very special meaning for me because of the way that it provides resources and support for artists. First and foremost, it's not an educational center at its heart. It's really a creative space for artists to explore and push things, And I love, it was my dream job. It was coming out of school, I didn't want to teach really. I thought if I could be the director of the Bray, that's what I'd want to do. And it just so happened I had that opportunity. And I feel we did a good job stewarding that place for the time that we were there, and we raised lots of money, we built buildings, we really supported hundreds of artists over the years. But there always comes a time, where it's time to pass that off to someone and let the next person sort of take that legacy on. So I left that job in 2022, and then my family and I bought a building. So I've been renovating this building for the last year and a half, and this will hopefully be the home of my new studio. It looks a little rough right now, but it's better if you were there. So I'm just excited about this next stage. My dream job at the time was being the director of the Bray, and then I think any artist you have in the back of your head, well, really, if it's possible, I'd love to just be a full-time artist, and I'm getting that opportunity to see if that's possible. So I feel very fortunate to have the support that I've had. This is going to be my kiln room, which is really exciting. I just bought this used electric kiln off of Facebook Marketplace. And it shipped to my house in Utah, from Idaho, I mean. And then I installed this kitchenette last month. So that's kind of where I am now. I'm really kind of looking to set up the space in a way that I can just expand my practice and, maybe think about different ways to structure it, so I can have flexibility as well with my family, and then also come do amazing things like this and be with all of you. So anyway, thank you, and I appreciate you for your time, and look forward to meeting more of you after this. And this is question and answer period. Rachel has a mic if anyone has a question. Oh, that's okay too.
Hey, this was fascinating. And I guess I don't know, maybe this might be more of a comment than a question, but one thing I noticed in your work with the blue and the white, and a good example is right here where you have it kind of, smeared a little bit, I guess. It looks sort of weathered.
Yeah.
And what struck me on one of the first slides was the bright colored birds with the weathered blue and white. And, I guess I noticed in the other ones, the collectible ancient ones, they're not smeared. They're all still pretty clear. Mm-hmm. So is there anything behind that, that approach? And I guess, secondly, a question, and when you do shows, do you make custom stuff for that show? Is that typical? And when people do galleries, I just ask because I don't know.
Okay.
And so, thank you.
Sure. So the first part, it's interesting you asked that because we were talking about that this morning when we were going through the collection. The way it originated for me was that I really wanted to start decorating the surfaces of things, but then I specifically wanted to figure out how to use that Korean technique. Just because, at the time, I just thought it just made sense to me, I wanted to figure that out. Separate from that, I was a big fan of Jun Kaneko's work, who I'm sure some of you have heard of. He makes these really big sculptures called damgos that look like steles, and he had this glaze that he used where he'd paint these polka dots or stripes and then the glaze would run, and I just, for whatever reason, that just stuck in my head, and I thought, I love the way that feels like it kind of represents time or like geology, all these things that it felt like it was just encapsulated in this one aesthetic detail, So I actually chased that specific thing for a long time. I was trying to figure out how to make that cobalt kind of come out of the surface, and I thought that I was the only one who had figured it out until we were in the collection today, and I saw an example from Joseon Dynasty Korea that looked exactly the same as this thing. And I'd never seen an example like that before. But I was looking and I was just like, oh my God, is this inlaid cobalt? It's flowing out of, with the glaze. So now I'm going to be thinking about that jar for a long time. I've been in so many collections, I've never seen one quite like that, But that's just kind of the evolution in my small timeline. But, as everything with ceramics, it's all been done in some fashion, right? And then for the exhibitions, typically, there's a lead time, so I might have a year or two to prepare for a show, and then I'll be making one specifically for that. Because, at least for me, it's I am thinking about the arrangement of things, or maybe there's threads of influence that are going through, from piece to piece. It's not just, okay, I made this piece, and I made this piece, and I made that piece. I do want there to be some way that those things are being kind of consistent with each other. Yeah.
The museums that are collecting your work that also have historic ceramics collections, where do you find your work being placed in the museums? Do you find them in conversation with historic Korean ceramics, or do you find them in the contemporary gallery or other contexts altogether?
I'd say a little bit of both, but probably mostly in a more contemporary realm, But the show in Portland was great because they let me show, I got to go look at the pieces and then make work based on those pieces. So there was a jar in the collection that I was kind of riffing off of, and there was the painting. So they had all that stuff out on display with my work, which I thought was really interesting. But that was a more, I think, customized kind of thing that I was speaking with the curator about. And that's what I love working with museums for that reason, is that I'm not an art historian, but I so respect the knowledge, It's this morning, it's I was talking to an encyclopedia, it's oh, what about this? What about that? When did this happen? How did this influence that? So I feel I'm learning a lot too about what's happening, but I'm also researching things and looking at it from a different perspective. So you hope that we're all kind of benefiting or growing from it. So yeah, that I think it's always a little bit different, but I think with the Renwick, for example, it's mostly contemporary work. Crystal Bridges, I'm assuming, is the same way.
Yeah, they focus on America.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
It's a two-part question.
Okay.
One, when do you bust open your pots? And then also, is it always before you put your design on or your glaze? Because when you were showing, when you were experimenting with colors, all of them had the glaze in bust out except for your blood moon.
Yeah.
And that had a white edge, so I could see it.
So with the decorated pieces, I have to decorate them first. So it's a little bit of a mind thing where it's like put in all this time, and then like that part only takes like a minute, you know, it's like, okay. So it's like, oh my gosh, I just spent like 2 days drawing on this thing, and then all of a sudden you have to do that. But so that's typically the rhythm of that. And then the colored ones are different because I actually, mostly I fire them to its highest temperature first with no glaze, and then I have to figure out how to get the glaze to stick to it afterwards. So I'm like spraying them or like pouring it on the inside and trying to like get it. And then those I generally have to refire maybe 3 or 4 times to get a more even surface on it. So it seems like it's, you know, they just have different ways that they're painting, you know, if that makes sense. But yeah, and I just had that happen. I had to fire a piece like 5 times because I kept seeing like little bits that, oh, I forgot to put glaze here, put it in back in, you know, but I've gotten used to that.
Structural question. Excuse me. Are you formulating the clay to melt at a certain temperature?
No,
Are you overfiring?
I'm firing it to its natural temperature, maybe a little hotter. You know, so they're going to like 2,300 Fahrenheit, I'd say. But it's just a standard growled porcelain that I get from the Archie Bray clay business. But I've been using it for a long time.
So do you intentionally allow them to slump on one side?
That's the hope.
Okay.
Yeah. So I have to set them up in the kiln so they don't like stick to everything, right? So there's one photo, right, you see I have all the sand out on the shelves. So then if they fall over a certain way, then I can take them off and then clean them all up and polish those sandy edges. Because the glaze will stick to anything it comes in contact with. But sometimes they go the other way, you know? And it's like, okay, I gotta figure out how to deal with that, you know?
Why did you choose to live in Montana?
So I was a resident artist at the Archie Bray coming out of undergraduate. And I didn't really know much about it. Like everyone seemed to know about it. Like it was known back then even. But I remember asking my friend, Michael Connolly, I said, hey, Michael, I got this residency in New Jersey and I have this residency in Montana. And this New Jersey one's paying me a little bit more money. It's like, just go to the break. Like, there's no question about it. So I was like, okay, I trust Michael. And I went. It changed my life, you know? Like, because it was a place that was like so dedicated to just giving like, numbskulls like me time to like figure things out and like freedom to work and support, you know? It wasn't like, hey, you have to do this and you have to clean, you know, like do all this stuff. It was just, here's the studio, do what artists do, just like explore, you know, experiment. And I remember leaving that job because I did think I was going to teach after undergrad. I thought that's the track I'm on. But when I left the Bray that summer, I thought, man, this is the place. Like, I don't think anybody realizes this is the greatest job you could possibly have, is to run this place because you can support all these artists. And I just kept that in the back of my head. And then when Josh DeWeese, who's my predecessor, and he was retiring, he said, hey, you should apply for this job. And, you know, and I also just love Montana because it was like, like I'm from Chicago. It's like, oh my God, there's no traffic here. I could be on a river in like 10 minutes. I could be on top of a mountain in like 30, So all of that stuff just was very enticing to me, like to have that space and freedom in a variety of different ways. And, and I loved like every minute that I was there. It was an incredible place to work for. And I met a lot of great people. I mean, Helena, the downside is it's not the most diverse place in the world, but the Bray was bringing people in from all over, the globe. Like we were bringing in artists from Japan, from South Africa, or South America, from Europe. Like, so in and of itself, it felt like you were getting that kind of influence. And it still does that. I think it's a real asset to the community in LA.
So now that you're a full-time artist, are you going to make functional pottery, or are your customers going to be like commissions from museums, or what's your plan? I'm just curious.
I think I'm going to do both, honestly. I'll probably primarily focus on the shows and exhibitions for the sculptural pieces, but I still love making pottery, and I think if I, I'm going to try to set it up so that I can do all of those things based on the timing. Because the nice thing about making pots is that they're a little more consistent to sell throughout the year, whereas exhibitions are it's like when they come, you got to be preparing for it. So yeah, that's part of the unknown, it's like how do you manage the time and interest, but that's what I'm going to try to do.
Over here.
Okay, I lived in Montana for 4 years. I love that state. I think it's amazing. And I noticed the same thing about magpies.
Yeah.
Montanans hate magpies. I think they're
So weird.
wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyways, I had a question for you because I've noticed location seems to have such a beautiful impact on how you play with form. I'm wondering if it affects how you play with material as well, Montana being such industrial and amazing part of the country for just geology. Does that ever come into play in your works?
I've thought about that. There have been people who've come in and done a lot of research around excavating glaze material from the state, which is very rich in feldspars and different kinds of clays and talc and things like that. But I don't think I have enough time to get into that. I think it's just it's going to take way too much of my life to really understand it. So I went the other way, and I feel like I'm just going to trust what exists, and then learn how to work within that as best I can. I think what affected me in terms of location there was my studio when I was the director at the Bray was in the resident studio. So I would just walk down the hall and be able to see all these 10, 20 other people, what they're working on, what they're struggling with, what they're thinking about. And that was always impacting me because on two levels. One was how do we make this organization fit their needs better, right? So that's kind of my job. But the other part is I'm thinking the same things as an artist. How are they struggling with that or wrestling with it? We'd have those conversations. And I think that was a really important part. So I am trying to think about that. How do I surround myself in a way with people that you can have that kind of connection or conversation that isn't about ego or competing or anything like that. It's no hierarchy, it's just sharing, And I think I'm just trying to be more intentional about getting out to do things, or staying connected to artists that I respect. It's a little harder, but I think it's an important part. I don't want to necessarily be just alone in the studio all the time.
I am wondering, it's a kind of a practical question. Did you ever worry about licensing issues because of Tony the Tiger and the rabbit tricks and the beautiful images of Bruce Lee, etc.?
Yeah.
Was that never a problem, or
I was curious about.
Good to hear.
Anyway.
Maybe one more. some love.
Yeah.
Bring us on.
I'm not sure I followed, when you have these, the structural pottery or whatever that's slumped or broken, whatever, and you do plan on them becoming broken, and they're unpredictable in that regard. But they also happen accidentally, and most artists would not share them or not exhibit because they would be broken or accidents or failures. And so but you've chosen to share them and to kind of, point out that there's beauty in flaws because it's kind of like life, right? So, but what I'm curious about, like, do you ever get negative feedback from other artists, especially maybe older ones, and especially Asians, who might object to your sharing structures that might be flawed or failures in some respect, but do you ever get any negative feedback amongst all the great feedback,
I get some negative responses, which I think is really interesting. Like sometimes people will ask these things like that piece just makes me feel so sad, or I find that sometimes people are bringing their own projections into the work, which I think is totally great. I don't want to prescribe a reaction to how the work is perceived. I want everyone to feel like they have their own freedom to do that. And for some people it's negative, and some people it's positive, but I've never had anyone come, why are you doing it? Get out of here. I've never had that, but I'm sure there are people probably, when I'm not around, are just like, oh my gosh, what is this guy doing? Which I think is okay. I think that's that's hopefully the point for me is it's just challenging what you think has some value or doesn't have value, and for me it's this practice has value because it kind of inspires my thinking in a lot of different ways, and I think, I hope that is happening for other people, but it may not, so I'm totally okay with that. I think that's fair.
Steve?
Okay, thanks everybody.